Integral to every society, comedy is there to ridicule the powerful and relieve the rest of us. But rapid social change can act as a divide between comedians and audiences, begging the question, can comedy only evolve alongside society's attitude shifts for so long? The debate was once whether racist, homophobic and sexist jokes were okay. And while that has long been shut down with a resounding no, social change is causing a new divide between those who think that comedy shouldn't offend, and those who insist offending is at the heart of good comedy, alongside the argument that comedians are too offensive versus audiences being too easily upset. Both comedians and their audiences are reflecting recent cultural shifts society has made towards a more inclusive society, including improved attitudes towards gender equality and LGBT rights. MTV Movie and Film Awards acting trophies, for example, were no longer categorized by gender, but given to the Best Actor in a Movie and Best Actor in a Show, in a move to modernize and reflect younger generations' views of gender as a spectrum. And last month, the New York subway announced it will use gender-neutral pronouns instead of ladies and gentlemen. Just like comedy routines about predictive texting might as well be from the Stone Age now, these milestones society has made to become more inclusive are rapidly dating some of the UK's most loved comedies. For example, it's hard to believe that as recently as 2006, comedians Matt Lucas and David Walliams dressed as transvestites and wore fat suits on their sitcom Little Britain. But more recently, Lucas said dressing as a rubbish transvestite now seems extremely insensitive. Even family-friendly Peter Kay and his character, Britain's Got the Pop Factor winner Geraldine, would struggle to get the laughs it once did. David Walliams and Matt Lucas as Little Britain characters Desiree and Bubbles Dever, BBC, Little Britain, we've surpassed the point where we'd question whether a man clumsily dressed as a woman is funny. Jen Lavery, spokesperson for comedy club The Stand, says, previously a comedian may have been able to get away with a sexist comment, you can see audiences are now generally less comfortable with that type of rhetoric, she says. People are also far more aware of trans issues now too, and certain jokes which may have got a laugh even a couple of years ago would now be viewed very differently. Now, the PC argument has moved on to whether comedians should address all genders at the expense of brevity, give audiences trigger warnings and avoid any controversial topics, despite coming at them from a liberal angle. Lavery says she has seen a rise in the number of audience complaints from its comedy venues across Edinburgh for the past few years. Some of these, she says, are knee-jerk reactions to a specific word or phrase, without paying attention to the context, like when someone complained about a comedian making jokes about epilepsy, despite the fact the act had made clear that they themselves were epileptic. Speaking to the BBC, journalist John Ronson said that audiences no longer pick up on the nuances of jokes. Nobody seems to be able to tell the difference between a racist joke and a liberal joke that comments on racism. And social media, some argue, only it exacerbates the issue. Comedian Andrew Doyle noted in an article for Spiked that he's seen an increase in people taking stand-up comedy at face value. He wrote, many comedians I've spoken to agree that this kind of entitled, moralistic response is more commonplace than ever before. Perhaps it's related to what psychologists have identified as a general escalation of narcissistic behavior. Or maybe it's an inevitable byproduct of social media, through which offense-seeking has turned into a kind of amateur sport. British comedian Gina Bashir now lives and works in the US, but began her career in the UK, and recently argued on BBC Radio that there's been a big shift in everybody getting offended about everything. She said social media has amplified how audiences respond when they hear something they don't like. Usually, when people were offended they walked out and told their friends and family and that was the end of it. Now, everybody has an opinion and everybody has to let everybody else know what this opinion is and something has to be done about it. Gina Yashir worries that social media has amplified people's offended responses, Getty, and this is affecting comedians, according to Doyle. He says, easily offended audiences aren't necessarily a threat to comedy insofar as the best comedians will always say whatever they want irrespective of societal pressures to tone down. That said, for economic reasons more and more comedians are self-censoring. Comics who make controversial decisions in their writing tend not to make the transition to television, for obvious reasons. And comedy club promoters are unlikely to rebook acts if they are perceived to be divisive. But not all comedians are noticing a shift towards more easily offended audiences, and say this could come down to demographics. Jenny Eclair said on BBC Radio that her audience doesn't mind being addressed within the constraints of traditional male and female genders. She said they aren't particularly petty, because they're middle-aged women with real issues to deal with, such as dying parents and redundancies. They have bigger fish to fry. They aren't actually sitting there thinking,